In the merciless days of the 15th and 16th centuries, one figure loomed large and ominous, an embodiment of terror and the unyielding grip of justice, the executioner. One such man, Franz Schmidt, served as the official executioner of Nuremberg from 1578 to 1617. Shrouded in darkness, this grim and enigmatic individual held the power of life and death in his very hands. With a single swing of the axe or the tightening of the noose, the executioner could silence the cries of the condemned forever. It was a profession that often brought notoriety and social isolation, but also a morbid fascination. Clad in a dark hood to shield their identity from the vengeful gaze of the crowd, the medieval executioner was both despised and revered. In a time when gruesome punishments such as the breaking wheel, drawing and quartering, and burning at the stake were commonplace, the executioner's skill and precision were crucial to a swift and, if possible, merciful end. Franz Schmidt, in his lifetime, recorded carrying out a staggering 361 executions and numerous other punishments. But beyond the blood-stained scaffolds and the horrifying spectacle of public executions, who were these men of death? Were they heartless killers or reluctant servants of a brutal system? As the famed French philosopher Voltaire once remarked, "It is forbidden to kill, therefore all murderers are punished, unless they kill in large numbers and to the sound of trumpets." Venture with us into the shadowy world of the medieval executioner and explore the complex nature of their lives and duties. Welcome to the Diary of Julius Caesar. Forging a grim fate, the making of medieval executioners. During the Middle Ages, the role of an executioner was both feared and shunned. Despite the stigma attached to the profession, there were individuals who chose to become the harbingers of death. To understand the journey of a medieval executioner, it is crucial to explore the process of training and apprenticeship that shaped their lives and careers. In a time when formal education was scarce, the path to becoming an executioner was often paved by family tradition. Many executioners hailed from families that had practiced the trade for generations. For instance, the legendary Sanson family served as France's royal executioners for over 2 centuries, from the late 1600s to the early 1800s. In such cases, young apprentices learned the trade from their fathers or other male relatives, passing down the family's grim legacy. Apprenticeships typically began in early adolescence, with the young apprentice assisting the executioner in various tasks. These tasks ranged from performing simple executions, such as hanging or drowning, to assisting in more complex and gruesome methods, such as drawing and quartering. Apprentices would also learn to care for and maintain the tools of their trade, such as the executioner's sword, the axe, or even the early versions of the guillotine. One famous historical figure who underwent this type of training was Franz Schmidt. Born in 1555 in present-day Germany, Schmidt was the son of a woodsman and a convicted poacher. At the age of 18, he was apprenticed to his stepfather, who was an executioner. Over the years, Schmidt honed his skills and eventually became the official executioner of Nuremberg in 1578. He held this position for 45 years and recorded his experiences in a journal, providing a rare and valuable glimpse into the life of an executioner during that time. Throughout their apprenticeship, aspiring executioners would witness various forms of punishment and execution. They would also become familiar with the accompanying rituals, such as reading the sentence aloud to the condemned, or ensuring the body was properly disposed of after the execution. An important part of their education was learning to deal with the psychological challenges of their profession. Many executioners relied on religion to find solace and justify their actions as instruments of divine justice. One anecdote from history illustrates the importance of precision in an executioner's work. In 1649, King Charles I of England was to be executed by decapitation. The appointed executioner, Richard Brandon, was so nervous about his task that he consumed a large amount of alcohol before the event. As a result, the first blow of his axe failed to sever the king's head, requiring a second strike to complete the task. This mishap only served to emphasize the importance of an executioner's expertise and training. Occasionally, a famous quote or phrase would emerge from the annals of executioner history. One such example comes from Charles-Henri Sanson, who was the chief executioner of France during the French Revolution. Sanson was responsible for executing King Louis XVI, and upon completing the task, he reportedly declared, "The king is no more." This phrase, while simple, symbolized the end of an era and the birth of a new political order. Instruments of retribution, the grisly art of medieval execution. The Middle Ages were marked by a variety of brutal and grisly methods of execution. Rulers and courts across Europe employed these punishments as a means to enforce their power, deter crime, and even provide a macabre form of entertainment for the masses. Delving into the dark world of medieval execution methods, we discover the tools and equipment wielded by the executioner, shedding light on the grim spectacles that once captivated and horrified audiences. One of the most common methods of execution during the Middle Ages was hanging. Reserved primarily for commoners, hanging was perceived as a relatively quick and efficient method. The condemned would be led to a scaffold or gallows, often accompanied by a procession and a priest to administer last rites. A noose made of hemp rope would be placed around the neck of the condemned, and the executioner would then remove the support beneath them, causing them to fall and be suspended by the rope. A skilled executioner would aim for the neck to snap, causing instant death. Beheading, another prominent method of execution, was typically reserved for nobility and those of higher social standing. In England, one of the most famous beheadings was that of Anne Boleyn, the second wife of King Henry VIII. In 1536, Anne was accused of adultery, incest and treason, and was sentenced to be executed by decapitation. The king, however, chose to show some degree of mercy by importing a skilled swordsman from France to perform the execution, rather than using the traditional axe. This was considered a more humane method, as the sharp sword would sever the head with a single swift blow. Burning at the stake was yet another method of execution in the Middle Ages, often reserved for those accused of heresy or witchcraft. In 1431, Joan of Arc, a French national heroine who claimed divine guidance, was captured by the English and charged with heresy. She was subsequently burned at the stake, her execution becoming a symbol of martyrdom. Victims of this gruesome method would be tied to a wooden stake, surrounded by flammable materials such as wood and straw. The executioner would then light the pyre, and the condemned would perish in the ensuing flames. Drawing and quartering, perhaps one of the most brutal methods of execution, was typically reserved for those convicted of high treason. The process involved several stages, including hanging the condemned until nearly dead, followed by disembowelment, beheading, and finally, the dismemberment of the body into 4 parts. One of the most infamous instances of this punishment occurred in 1305, when Scottish patriot William Wallace was captured by the English and subjected to this brutal execution method. The tools and equipment used by executioners in these methods were both simple and macabre. Axes, swords, and the dreaded executioner's block were the primary tools for beheadings. For hangings, a well-constructed gallows and a strong hemp rope were the essential components. In burnings, the executioner would require a sturdy stake and an abundance of flammable materials. And for drawing and quartering, a sharp knife or blade would be used to carry out the disembowelment and dismemberment. In the words of the 16th century poet François Villon, "Where are the snows of yesteryear?" These haunting lines remind us that the era of brutal executions in the Middle Ages has long since passed, but the instruments of retribution wielded by executioners still loom large in our collective memory. By examining the tools and methods employed in these grim spectacles, we gain a deeper understanding of the harsh realities of medieval justice and the harrowing ordeals that once held sway over society. The breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel, was yet another horrific tool used to execute criminals. The condemned would be tied to a large wooden wheel with their limbs spread out and secured to the spokes. The executioner would then use an iron bar or hammer to break the bones of the victim, rendering them incapable of escaping their agonizing fate. The wheel would then be hoisted into the air on a pole, exposing the broken and battered individual to the elements, where they would ultimately perish. Another method of execution, though less common, was the gruesome practice of boiling alive. In 1531, Englishman Richard Roos was found guilty of attempting to poison John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester. Roos was sentenced to be boiled alive in a large cauldron filled with water or oil. The executioner would be responsible for overseeing the heating of the cauldron and ensuring that the condemned met their grisly end in this torturous manner. The various methods of execution employed throughout the Middle Ages were undoubtedly brutal and merciless, but they served a distinct purpose in the minds of the ruling class. By subjecting criminals to these horrifying punishments, they sought to reinforce their authority, deter would-be transgressors, and maintain a semblance of order in a time when violence and chaos often reigned supreme. Shrouded in darkness, the veiled identity of medieval executioners. In the shadows of history, the medieval executioner loomed as a figure of fear and dread. Cloaked in darkness, both literally and figuratively, these grim enforcers of justice donned distinct attire that served to conceal their identity from the public eye. By exploring the reasons behind the executioner's need for anonymity and the distinctive clothing and masks they wore, we uncover a hidden facet of their lives, entwined with secrecy and stigma. To understand the executioner's need for anonymity, one must first consider the societal context in which they operated. In the Middle Ages, executioners were often ostracized and viewed as social pariahs. They were considered untouchables, and their profession was deemed dishonorable. This stigma extended to their families, making it challenging for executioners and their kin to form meaningful relationships with others in their community. Given this social isolation, it is unsurprising that executioners sought to maintain some degree of anonymity when performing their duties. By concealing their identities, they hoped to minimize the risk of retribution from the friends or families of those they executed and reduce the social stigma that might befall them in their day-to-day lives. The attire worn by executioners varied depending on the region and time period. However, some common elements helped to shield their identities from the onlooking public. One of the most recognizable aspects of the executioner's ensemble was the hood or mask. Often made from black cloth or leather, these hoods would cover the executioner's face, leaving only their eyes exposed. In some cases, the hoods were adorned with grotesque and fearsome features, serving to both intimidate the condemned and further obscure the wearer's identity. In addition to the hood or mask, executioners would typically wear dark, unadorned clothing that would blend into the shadows and prevent them from standing out in a crowd. This somber attire often included a long coat or cloak, gloves and sturdy boots, all of which served to protect the executioner from the grisly nature of their work and keep their identity shrouded in darkness. While many executioners chose to maintain their anonymity, there were some who gained notoriety and became well-known figures of their time. One such individual was Charles-Henri Sanson, the chief executioner of France during the French Revolution. Despite the widespread knowledge of his profession, Sanson was considered a man of integrity and honor, even gaining the respect of some of his contemporaries. His infamous role in the execution of King Louis XVI and other high-profile figures during the Revolution cemented his place in history as a key player in a tumultuous period. Another curious anecdote regarding executioner attire involves the 16th century German executioner Franz Schmidt. As the official executioner of Nuremberg, Schmidt was required to wear the traditional hood and cloak while performing his duties. However, upon retiring from his position, he reportedly burned his executioner's attire in a public display, symbolically severing ties with his grim profession and shedding the stigma associated with it. Outcasts by the blade, the lonesome world of the medieval executioner. The medieval executioner, shrouded in mystery and darkness, was a figure both feared and reviled. Tasked with the grisly duty of carrying out society's most brutal punishments, these individuals bore the weight of a heavy social stigma that extended far beyond the scaffold. The occupation of the executioner was often regarded as dishonorable and shameful, a role thrust upon those who had few other options for survival. Frequently, the position was passed down from one generation to the next, trapping entire families in a cycle of stigma and isolation. In some cases, individuals were forced into the role as a form of punishment or to repay a debt, ensuring that their lives would forever be marked by the taint of their grim profession. Within their communities, executioners were often treated as pariahs, avoided and shunned by their neighbors. They were considered untouchable, and their mere presence was believed to bring misfortune and ill luck. This ostracism extended to nearly every aspect of their lives, from where they lived to the opportunities they had for social interaction. Executioners were often relegated to living on the outskirts of towns, near cemeteries, or other places associated with death and decay. Even when entering a city or town, they were often required to announce their presence, allowing the residents to avoid them if they so desired. Despite their isolation, executioners were not entirely without means or resources. In some cases, they were provided with a modest income, housing, and even a degree of legal protection by the authorities that employed them. This support, however, did little to counteract the pervasive stigma that surrounded their lives and the scorn they faced from their fellow citizens. The personal lives of executioners were similarly fraught with difficulty. Many struggled to form lasting relationships, as few were willing to associate with someone who bore the taint of their profession. Marriages, if they occurred at all, were often arranged within families of executioners, ensuring that the stigma remained contained within their insular community. Despite the adversity they faced, some executioners managed to find solace and even a degree of respect within their profession. The aforementioned Franz Schmidt of Nuremberg, who served as the city's official executioner for 45 years, kept a detailed journal of his work, providing a rare glimpse into the life and mindset of a man who carried out society's most grisly tasks. Schmidt's writings reveal a deep sense of duty and commitment to his work, as well as a desire to be recognized for his skill and professionalism. Another tale that illuminates the complex relationship between executioners and the society that shunned them is the story of the legendary English executioner Jack Ketch. Ketch, who served as the official executioner of London in the late 17th century, gained a reputation for his brutality and incompetence. Despite his infamy, Ketch managed to amass a small fortune through bribes and other illicit means, highlighting the uneasy balance between the public's revulsion for the executioner and their reliance on his services to maintain order. Blood money, the grim rewards of the medieval executioner. In the harsh world of the Middle Ages, the executioner served as the grim arbiter of justice, meting out punishments and enforcing the law in a society fraught with violence and upheaval. But while their profession was shrouded in darkness and stigma, these enigmatic figures were not without their rewards. Executioners in the Middle Ages were typically compensated in several ways, with their earnings varying depending on the region and the specific circumstances of their employment. One common form of payment was a fixed salary, provided by the local authorities who employed them. This steady income offered a degree of financial security, though it was often modest in comparison to the earnings of other skilled tradesmen. In addition to their base salary, executioners were often entitled to fees for performing specific tasks. These fees could vary depending on the complexity and severity of the punishment being administered, with particularly gruesome or high-profile executions commanding higher prices. For example, an executioner might receive a relatively small fee for carrying out a simple hanging, while more elaborate and grisly methods, such as drawing and quartering or burning at the stake, might fetch a premium. Executioners were also sometimes granted additional perks and benefits as part of their compensation package. In certain regions, they were given a measure of legal protection, ensuring that they could not be prosecuted for acts committed in the course of their duties. This was particularly important, given the violent nature of their work and the potential for retribution from the friends or families of those they executed. One particularly curious aspect of the executioner's compensation was the practice of granting them the right to claim the belongings of the condemned. This macabre form of inheritance could prove quite lucrative, particularly in cases where the victim was a wealthy or high-ranking individual. Executioners might also be entitled to a portion of the fines levied against the condemned or their families, further sweetening the pot for those willing to engage in this grim profession. Despite the various forms of compensation available to executioners, their financial prospects were often uncertain, and many struggled to make ends meet. This precarious financial position led some executioners to seek additional income through less savory means. For example, they might accept bribes from the condemned or their families in exchange for a swift and merciful death, or engage in the illicit trade of body parts, selling the remains of their victims to medical professionals or collectors. Grim shadows, the hidden torment of the medieval executioner. In the unforgiving world of the Middle Ages, the executioner played a vital yet reviled role, dispensing brutal justice and instilling fear in the hearts of the populace. While their profession earned them a living, it also exacted a heavy psychological toll on those who wielded the axe or the noose. To be an executioner was to be intimately familiar with death, pain, and suffering. Day after day, these individuals were tasked with taking the lives of their fellow humans, often in the most brutal and agonizing ways imaginable. This grim duty inevitably left a mark on their psyche, with many executioners grappling with feelings of guilt, remorse, and despair. The constant exposure to violence and death could also result in symptoms similar to what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, with the executioner haunted by flashbacks and nightmares long after the axe had fallen. In the face of this psychological torment, executioners developed various coping mechanisms to protect their mental health and maintain a semblance of stability. One such strategy was to view their work as a necessary duty, an essential service they provided to society in order to maintain law and order. By framing their actions as a form of divine justice, they could distance themselves from the brutality of their deeds and find solace in the belief that they were acting in accordance with a higher purpose. Another coping mechanism employed by some executioners was to focus on the technical aspects of their work, honing their skills and taking pride in their expertise. By concentrating on the precision and efficiency of their methods, they could distance themselves from the inherent cruelty of their actions and derive satisfaction from their mastery of a difficult and demanding craft. Despite these coping strategies, the psychological burden of their profession could still prove overwhelming for some executioners. Alcoholism, depression, and other forms of mental illness were not uncommon among these individuals, as they sought to numb the pain and silence the ghosts that haunted their thoughts. One poignant example of the emotional turmoil faced by executioners can be found in the story of Charles-Henri Sanson, the chief executioner of France during the French Revolution. In his memoirs, Sanson describes the guilt and regret he felt after executing King Louis XVI, confessing that he was tormented by the memory of the fallen monarch and struggled to reconcile his actions with his own conscience. This powerful account serves as a stark reminder of the complex and often anguished emotional landscape that lay beneath the executioner's hood. Between heaven and hell, the rituals of the medieval executioner. In the shadowy world of the medieval executioner, the line between life and death was a fine one, and the rituals that surrounded their grim work were charged with symbolic and practical significance. Before an execution, the executioner would often engage in a series of preparatory rituals, both to ensure the smooth running of the event and to invoke divine protection and guidance. One such practice was the testing and maintenance of their tools and equipment. The blade of the axe or sword would be sharpened and polished, the rope of the gallows inspected for flaws, and the machinery of the breaking wheel or the rack carefully calibrated. By attending to these practical details, the executioner sought to minimize the risk of error and ensure a swift and efficient death for the condemned. Beyond the practical aspects of their work, executioners were also keenly aware of the spiritual dimensions of their profession. In many cases, they would engage in prayer and other devotional practices before an execution, seeking forgiveness for their actions and invoking the divine support of their patron saints. This sacred element of their work served to reinforce the idea that they were acting as agents of divine justice, helping them to cope with the moral and ethical challenges of their trade. During the execution itself, the rituals and customs that governed the proceedings varied depending on the method of execution and the local traditions of the region. In some cases, the condemned would be granted a final meal or the opportunity to confess their sins before a priest, while in others, they would be subjected to a public display of humiliation and suffering designed to serve as a deterrent to others. The executioner would often play a central role in these ceremonies, acting as both the instrument of justice and the embodiment of society's collective rage and retribution. Once the execution had been carried out, the executioner's responsibilities did not end. They were often charged with disposing of the remains, whether by burial, cremation, or other means. In some cases, the bodies of the executed would be put on public display as a warning to others, with the executioner tasked with arranging the gruesome tableau. In other instances, they would be responsible for distributing the remains to medical professionals or collectors, who valued them for their educational or macabre appeal. The Dark Emperors, notorious executioners of the ages. In the grim annals of history, the names of certain executioners stand out, etched in infamy for their role in shaping the course of events and the destinies of those who crossed their paths. Our journey begins with the enigmatic figure of Franz Schmidt, a German executioner who plied his trade in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Hailing from a family of executioners, Schmidt was known for his exceptional skill and professionalism. Over the course of his 45-year career, he is said to have executed more than 350 people, meticulously documenting each act in his personal journal. Despite the stigma attached to his profession, Schmidt was renowned for his piety and his dedication to his family, a testament to the complex and often contradictory nature of the executioner's world. As we travel across the Channel to England, we encounter the notorious figure of Jack Ketch, an English executioner whose name has become synonymous with brutality and incompetence. Active during the late 17th century, Ketch's gruesome reputation was cemented by a series of botched executions, most notably that of the Duke of Monmouth in 1685. During this ill-fated event, Ketch is said to have taken 5 blows to sever the Duke's head, with some accounts claiming that he resorted to using a knife to complete the grisly task. In the centuries since, Ketch's name has lived on in infamy, a dark spectre that haunts the annals of British history. Across the Atlantic, we find the enigmatic figure of Tom Horn, a legendary scout and lawman of the American West, who also served as an executioner during the latter years of the 19th century. Horn's career as an executioner was marked by controversy, with many questioning the legality and morality of his methods. He is perhaps best remembered for his role in the hanging of William "Willie" Nicol, a young man accused of cattle rustling, an act that would ultimately lead to Horn's own execution in 1903. Returning to the European continent, we encounter the chilling figure of Anatole Diebler, a French executioner who presided over the guillotine during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Known for his efficiency and professionalism, Diebler executed over 400 people during his tenure, including the infamous anarchist Ravachol and the notorious serial killer Henry Landru. Despite the grim nature of his work, Diebler was a private and reserved man, shunning the spotlight and striving to maintain a semblance of normalcy in his personal life. A macabre spectacle, the theatre of public executions in the Middle Ages. In the turbulent world of the Middle Ages, public executions were a grim and ubiquitous fixture of society, casting their long shadow over the lives of the highborn and the lowly alike. To understand the complex tapestry of emotions, motivations, and desires that bound these brutal spectacles to the hearts and minds of their audience, we must delve into the multifaceted role they played in the medieval world. In an age before television and the internet, public executions offered a morbid form of entertainment for the masses, drawing large crowds eager for the thrill of the spectacle. The gruesome details of the condemned's fate would often be announced in advance, and the crowd would gather early to secure the best vantage points. Hawkers would sell food and drink, and a carnival-like atmosphere would pervade the air. The crowd would jeer and mock the condemned, delighting in their suffering and degradation. In this way, public executions served as a form of catharsis for the masses, allowing them to vent their frustrations and fears upon a hapless scapegoat. Beyond their role as entertainment, public executions also served as a powerful deterrent to crime. In a society where the rule of law was often tenuous at best, the authorities relied on the threat of public punishment to maintain order and instill fear in the hearts of potential wrongdoers. The grisly fate that awaited those who transgressed the boundaries of acceptable behavior was intended to serve as a stark warning to others, a vivid reminder of the consequences of stepping outside the narrow confines of the law. In this way, public executions were a vital tool in the arsenal of medieval law enforcement, a stark reminder of the ever-present threat of retribution that loomed over the lives of those who dared to defy the established order. At their core, public executions were also a potent display of authority and power. By meting out punishment in such a public and brutal fashion, the ruling classes sought to assert their dominion over the lives of their subjects and reinforce the idea that they were the ultimate arbiters of life and death. The presence of high-ranking officials at these events underscored this message, lending the weight of their authority to the proceedings and ensuring that the audience was left in no doubt as to who held the reins of power. In this way, public executions served as a form of political theatre, a stage upon which the ruling classes could demonstrate their control over the forces of chaos and disorder that threatened to engulf the medieval world. From darkness to light, the evolution and transformation of the executioner's role. The role of the executioner has undergone significant changes throughout history, shaped by the shifting tides of public opinion, advances in technology, and the evolving understanding of justice and punishment. This journey, from the dark corners of the Middle Ages to the more enlightened modern era, reflects the broader transformation of society itself and offers a unique window into the ever-changing landscape of human morality. In the Middle Ages, the executioner was a figure of fear and dread, an embodiment of society's most primal instincts for vengeance and retribution. Cloaked in anonymity and armed with the tools of their grim trade, these individuals held the power of life and death in their hands, meting out punishment at the behest of their masters. As public opinion began to shift, however, the role of the executioner began to evolve. The Enlightenment brought about new ideas and values, leading to a reassessment of the morality of capital punishment and the place of the executioner in society. This transformation was further accelerated by the rise of new technologies, such as the guillotine, which promised a more humane and efficient method of execution. Invented in the late 18th century by Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin, the guillotine was intended to democratize the process of execution, ensuring that all condemned individuals, regardless of their social status, would meet the same swift and painless end. This development marked a turning point in the evolution of the executioner's role, as the traditional skills of the trade began to be replaced by mechanization and automation. As the 19th century progressed, the debate surrounding the morality of capital punishment continued to intensify, fueled by the work of philosophers, writers, and social reformers. In the United States, the abolitionist movement gained momentum, leading to a re-evaluation of the role of the executioner and the ethics of state-sanctioned killing. This process culminated in the 20th century with the gradual abolition of many forms of capital punishment in countries around the world, as societies sought to find more humane and effective means of addressing crime and punishment. In the modern era, the role of the executioner has become increasingly marginalized, as many countries have turned away from the practice of capital punishment altogether. Where executions still take place, they are often carried out by trained professionals operating in a clinical and detached environment. The executioner of the past, with their hood and axe, has given way to the faceless technician, administering a lethal injection or operating an electric chair. In the words of the great philosopher George Santayana, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. By delving into the lives of the executioners who once wielded the axe and the noose, We ensure that their stories will not be forgotten, and that we continue to learn from the lessons of history. Thank you for joining us on this chilling exploration of the life of an executioner in the Middle Ages. If you enjoyed this journey through the shadows of the past, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more fascinating glimpses into the untold stories of history. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the hidden corners of our shared past.